Well, let's go ahead and get started. We want to make sure that we obviously respect your time, and we want to make sure that the full hour, we give as much time to our incredible speaker today, Dr. David Scobey, who we are just thrilled to be kicking off this series with us. Just as a way of introduction, my name is Patty Robinson. I am the Faculty Director of Civic and Community Engagement at College of the Canyons. We are a community college located in North Los Angeles County, for those of you who might not know where we're located. Excuse me. This is the first of 7 presentations that will be running from September 18th through October 30th. This is our Civic Dialogue series, and we are incredibly happy to be putting this series together for all of you and for those individuals up and down the state. And I have a feeling we might have some folks even coming from out of state today. As I said, we have 7 of these presentations that are scheduled for the next few weeks, and we've been lucky enough to add on 2 more that will allow a deeper dive into 2 of the topics, both of which include project-based learning and integrative learning. This particular series came out of a Bringing Theory to Practice grant, which involved the intersegmental partnership and collaboration between several community colleges and several 4-year colleges in the California Community College and Cal State systems. Particularly, we've been working with College of the Canyons, Cerritos College. My colleague and peer, Kimberly Rosenfeld, is on the Zoom, and you will be meeting her later. And then also Jan Connell, who is not here at the moment, but we've been working very, very closely together, along with Kimberly Costino from Cal State Dominguez Hills, as well as Julie Heinen from CSU Northridge. So this particular collaboration between the 2 community colleges and the 2 CSUs, as we're forming a civic engagement partnership and collaboration that we hope that we will be getting more partnerships on board in the next few years. Also, I want to mention that our goal today, as you've probably already seen our learning outcomes, but I'd like to read them to you because this is, again, framing today's conversation. We hope to advance your understanding of the intersectionality between equity and civic engagement for promoting the public good. We also hope to recognize civic, community, and democratic engagement as a high impact practice for student success. And third, we hope to build capacity to leverage your current position, experience, and knowledge for impacting positive local and global change. So when we look at this today, we have the distinct pleasure of launching our series, which we hope will continue in the spring and also next year, with, I want to say, just this amazing scholar, researcher, and incredible person, Dr. David Scobey. I have had the distinct pleasure of working with Dr. Scobey on several projects through Bringing Theory to Practice, and most recently the PLACE grant, which is a collaboration between several colleges and universities from around the country. And just to give you an idea of this man's incredible background, and this does not even give him or do him justice. David Scobey joined Bringing Theory to Practice as director in July 2018. For 20 years, he has worked to advance the democratic purposes of higher education, especially through the integration of public engagement with liberal education and the inclusion of underserved students. From 1989 to 2005, he taught American Studies, U.S. Cultural Citizenship Program, History and Architecture at the University of Michigan. In 1998, he founded University of Michigan's Arts of Citizenship Program, which fostered public work and community projects in the arts, humanities, and design. He has served as director of the Harvard Center for Community Partnerships at Bates College, 2005 to 10, the inaugural executive dean of the School for Public Engagement at the New School in New York City from 2010 to 2014, and a senior scholar for the Graduate Network, which supports college access and success for adult learners, 2014 to 2018. He has a PhD in American Studies from Yale University and is the author of Empire City, The Making and Meaning of the New York City Landscape, as well as other studies of U.S. cultural and urban history, and he writes extensively on the recent history of current issues in higher education. And if you have not read his work, please, please do so. Again, just the amount of publications that this gentleman has written are just a fantastic introduction to civic and community engagement. So with that, I am turning it over to Dr. David Scobey.
Thank you, Patty. That's way too generous an introduction. I really, really appreciate it. I want to thank 3CSN and Jan Connell and Kimberly Rosenfeld and my friend Patty Robinson for inviting me to kick off this series. And I want to thank everyone for attending. The theme couldn't be more important, couldn't be more timely. I'm going to speak to the timeliness of it later. And I think you have a fabulous roster of speakers coming up. I hope I can do them justice today in batting lead off on this batting order. Patty gave you a sense of who I am. I've been working on issues of democracy and higher education for more than 20 years at the University of Michigan and at Bates College and the New School. I've been active in national consortia and projects like the founding of Imagining America, Artists and Scholars in Public Life. I was on the task force that helped to write the Crucible Moment report, which, if you haven't had a chance to read, I think is the single most important document that's come out of the movement for democratic and civic engagement in the last decade or so. Written by my colleague Karen McTighe-Musel at the Association of American Colleges and Universities. And now I'm fortunate to be directing Bringing Theory to Practice, which is located here at Elon University. You are seeing me in my on-campus faculty apartment this morning. So my apologies for the personal decor. But I'm delighted to be here and delighted to be talking with you. I look forward to our dialogue. If you look at the whole Civic Dialogue series, you've got an incredible string of speakers who are coming. They're going to focus a lot, based on the plan, on civic pedagogical practices and the design of curricula and majors and high impact practices, on the civic purposes of student-centered learning, a whole range of ground level and campus level implications of what it means to center the civic and democratic mission of higher ed. And I note what all of those future speakers are going to be doing because it lets me off the hook for not doing those. I'm going to leave those issues to my colleagues. They're real exemplars and will have wonderful things to say. The task that I've been given as the leadoff batter is to step back from those issues of campus practice, departmental practice, and pedagogy, and to give you my views of some key elements about what we mean by the civic and democratic mission of higher ed. Why is it important in terms of the values that underlie it, and why is it important in terms of the current crisis in higher education that we are living through. I'm going to start talking about both the values question and the context that we're in by actually going back to a landmark document in the history of the democracy tradition in higher education. And I'm thinking of the 1947 report of the Truman Commission on Higher Education and American Democracy. I want to use this report in two different ways to frame up talking about both values and context. First, I want to use it thematically as a really wonderful exemplar of some of the key assumptions that I think are important about the meaning and the value of education for democracy in the US. So thematically, it's a really helpful window on how to think about higher education for democracy. And then secondly, I want to use it as a historical document, as a democratic manifesto that very explicitly talks about its own context and the historical conditions under which it was made, and gives us important insights about the historical conditions for this whole project of integrating civic and democratic engagement into higher education. And then I want to bring both sides of that argument, both the values components of what we mean by higher education for democracy and the historical moments in which those themes get activated. I want to bring them to bear in the second part of my remarks on the present moment that we're living through. It's a moment in which the democratic mission of our work is especially urgent, I want to argue, and that's what makes this series so important and timely. So first of all, the Truman Commission report. I could have reached back to a whole series of different moments in texts as a kind of anchor or an allegory or a proof text for starting off a conversation about higher education and democracy. Could have spoken about the Morrill Land Grant that founded land-grant colleges, passed in 1862. I could have talked about the founding of historically Black colleges and universities, or women's colleges, or progressive higher ed with such figures as Jane Addams and John Dewey, or labor colleges in the 1920s, or even the California plan that systematized the three systems of the California higher ed system in the early 1960s. There's an incredibly important democracy tradition that connects all of these different examples within the history of American higher ed, and that asserts civic and democratic values over and against more instrumental or technocratic or vocational visions of our mission. That tradition runs through the history of American higher education. And I'm actually going to speak about that tradition a little later. But the Truman Commission report is especially powerful for reasons that I hope will become clear. It's one of the most important documents in the history of American higher education. It's part of a moment in the late 1940s and early 1950s that basically created the academy that we all work in and live in today. In the years from about 1944 to 1950, you saw the passage of the GI Bill of Rights that brought millions of veterans into higher education for the first time. You saw the federal report called Science, the Eternal Frontier, that launched the federal government as the sponsor of university-based research. And you saw this Truman Commission that was commissioned in late 1946 and delivered the report I'm going to be discussing a year later. Truman charged the commission with making recommendations for federal policy about what higher ed should look like nationally. It was the very first time there had ever been an effort to create national higher ed policy. And he did it, President Truman, in the context of the Allied victory in World War II, the rise of American preeminence globally, the need to expand access to higher education in light of economic changes, and the rise of the Cold War. The report was chaired by a man named George Kook, K-O-O-K, who had been since the 1920s an advocate for community colleges, a former college president, the head of the American Council on Education for 15 years, and also, as it turns out, the leading policy analyst for the GI Bill a year or two earlier than the Truman Commission. So truly a kind of pioneer and visionary of what American higher ed should look like. Now, Truman didn't necessarily underscore in his charge to the commission the importance of democracy in the mission of higher education. And the 6 volumes of the report cover a range of different topics. They're exhaustive. They're really interesting in a whole range of ways. You can download it for free in Google Books, and it's really worth browsing in. But what I want to stress today is that education for democracy is what the report led with. It starts, the President's Commission on Higher Education has attempted to select from among the principal goals for higher education, those which should come first in our time. And the first of 3 goals that it lists are education for a fuller realization of democracy in every phase of living. Now, this sounds an awful lot like the traditional mission statement palaver in every institution I've been part of, probably a lot of your institutions. But what's interesting about it is that it's more than just window dressing. The report unpacks in great detail and with great complexity what education for democracy means. And I'm going to apologize right now for quoting a whole bunch of passages from it extensively, because they give us the raw material for our thinking about how we should think about higher education and democracy. So here's some language, some excerpts from the Truman Commission report. Quote, "It's a commonplace of the democratic faith that education is indispensable to freedom of thought and faith. The social role of education is to ensure equal liberty and equal opportunity to different groups and individuals, and to teach citizens how to redirect forces, men, and events. No one would deny that a study of human history can contribute immeasurably to understanding the present. But education is also about the making of the future. Its role in a democratic society is that of critic and leader, as well as servant." Another passage. "The first goal of education for democracy is the full, rounded, and continuing development of the person." The first goal of education for democracy is the full, rounded, and continuing development of the person. Yet individual freedom entails communal responsibility. Today, less than ever can we afford the social loss that occurs when educated men and women refrain from taking part in public affairs. Democracy is more than a set of political processes. It's a way of life, a way of thinking and feeling and acting with one another. The integration of democratic principles into the active life of a person and a people is not achieved by merely studying it. We must give students every possible experience in democratic processes within the college community. The campus should be employed as a laboratory of the democratic way of life. Nor should the college neglect the resources of life outside, which can do much to break down the present tendency of isolation of the college from the wider community. Citizens need to know not only the greatness of democracy, but its present imperfections. To recognize and admit defects is not to disparage democracy, it is merely to see clearly the extent of its unfinished business. So again, I want to apologize for just reading so many quotes. And let me first of all say the commission backed up this rhetoric with an extraordinary set of recommendations that were radical then and are still radical now. It called for the dismantling of all racial segregation in higher ed. This is 8 years before Brown, via the Board of Education. It called for free community college and tuition-free access to the first 2 years of four-year colleges. And it called for robust scholarship support for all low-income students. We are still fighting for those democratic objectives. So again, let me apologize for reading all this, but it's unbelievably refreshing to read what a national, federally commissioned vision of higher ed looked like. It's so much larger and more large-minded and more creative pedagogically and more holistic and more democratic than what would be possible today. And I want to use that language and those proposals to step back and use the Truman Commission as kind of raw material to think with and to underscore some key themes and takeaways that help me conceptualize why I think democracy needs higher education, and so why higher education has a civic and democratic mission. So kind of stepping back from that language and thinking with it, here are 6 takeaways that are key to my understanding of higher ed and democracy. Takeaway 1, democracy needs higher education because higher education is essential to the making of citizens as part of its mission of developing the whole person. It's not that the report or that anyone else ignores the individual benefits of economic mobility or individual opportunity. That's the kind of language of individual benefit that is dominant today, and it's absolutely important. But the focus of the report is actually on the making of civic selves, on the connection between being a whole person and being a citizen. It evokes for me what's so revolutionary about the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. The amendment guarantees citizenship and expands the community of who counts as whole persons with full human rights to formerly enslaved people, to children, to immigrants, to future citizens. Its commitment of birthright citizenship was an incredible achievement. But what the 14th Amendment actually doesn't speak to is what this report speaks to, which is that citizens have to be made through education. They have to be prepared to take part in democratic public life and to share our common public sphere with other people with whom they share a common fate, but not common experiences or values. That entering into a diverse, divided, unequal community where we have to figure out democratically how to live together. And that means that there is no such thing as citizenship without what we could broadly call citizenship schools, spaces where citizens are made as civic selves. Universities and colleges are not the only kind of citizen schools that we have. In fact, that phrase comes from the history of the civil rights movement, and social movements have been important citizenship schools, as have labor unions, as are obviously K-12 schools, PTAs, religious congregations. There's a whole archipelago of citizenship schools in our society when it's working well. Higher ed is one of the most important of them. Now, this emphasis on the civic development of the individual student as a citizen, I think you'll be coming back to it a lot in future sessions, because the topics of those sessions, I think, speak to the practices that help students develop as civic selves, as citizens. What's interesting about the report, though, is that it doesn't stop there. It adds other dimensions to its vision of what it means to commit higher education to civic and democratic life, along with and beyond simply the education of students and citizens. It also stresses the importance of higher education in fashioning democratic communities. And a democratic collectivity, what we might call the making of we the people to which we all belong. Higher ed for democracy isn't just about civic learning, then it's also about the colleges and universities' institutional structures, its research, its capacity for public problem solving. And it's also about civic and democratic learning, also has to be about engaging students and faculty and staff in what I would call the cultural work of building a diverse, multiracial, democratic community. It's about building a diverse, inclusive we in our society. Another way of putting this is that the democratic mission of higher education, as I see it, isn't only about the civic development of the individual student. It's that. It isn't only about community partnerships and problem solving. It's that. It's also about helping to create a national, a regional, a community in which we find ourselves and learn to see ourselves in solidarity with each other across differences, across inequalities, so that we can fashion a common life together. So that building of democratic communities is as important as the making of civic selves. Third takeaway, both of these missions that I've laid out, the making of citizens and the making of democratic communities, means that higher ed has to solve a whole range of practical, institutional, on-the-ground questions about what I would call the who, the what, the how, and the where of democratic education. The who of education has to be democratic. The Truman Commission report actually makes one of its radical calls that every single American adult ought to have access to higher education. It calls for affordable higher education, for the tearing down of Jim Crow segregationist exclusions. And a lot of the history of the democracy tradition in the United States is all about expanding the who of who gets access to education here. I'm thinking, of course, of the founding of minority-serving institutions, HBCUs, and others, of women's colleges, the history of affirmative action and of Pell Grants. There's a whole range of struggles, both historically and in the present, to democratize the who of who can gain the benefits of higher education. But the democratic vision is also about the what of education. Truman Commission report invites us to think about building democratic communities and persons, not just in history classes or civics classes or political science classes, but across the whole curriculum. It's asking us to think about what civic learning looks like in classics, or neuropsych, or engineering, or ESL, or speech. How does the centrality of civic learning then change pedagogy and curriculum in all of those departments or in the research agenda of their fields? It radicalizes the content of what we think education should be. This vision also makes us think about that the how of learning ought to be democratic, that we have to integrate classroom learning based on reading and critical thinking and discussion with experiential learning that the community engagement movement and the service learning movement has been so active on. And it also makes us think about, as from a quote from the report that I said, that the campus and the institution are themselves laboratories for immersion in a democratic way of life. This is something I think we haven't been good at. The idea that the everyday life of student, faculty, and staff ought to be a laboratory of democratic practice is much less well developed than the kind of curricular and student life co-curricular practices of our movement. And finally, there's the takeaway that the where of higher education has to be democratic, not just in the curriculum, but in the student life co-curriculum, not just on campus, but in the community. So it's giving us a very full-bodied set of ambitions for what it means to really democratize higher education and to make all of the practices, all of the areas of study, all of the everyday life of higher education a place where we teach democracy and model democracy. Here's the fourth takeaway. All of that, those are complicated mandates. I'm sure you can be thinking about where your own teaching or service learning projects or student life work might advance it. But I'm also bet you're thinking about how difficult it would be to really fully operationalize this kind of full-bodied, three-dimensional vision of democratic education. It's wide-ranging and yet it's holistic. It affects teaching and research and student life. In other words, it would require significant resources and significant autonomy and the space of significant creativity to really figure out how to do this. My fourth takeaway then is that beneath all these complex requirements, there has to be a social compact between higher education as a whole and the larger society that's necessary to give us the resources and the autonomy that higher ed needs to fulfill this social mission, to provide opportunity and mobility, to create useful knowledge, to educate young people for full personhood. There has to be a sense in the larger society that it's legitimate for the academy to have the resources and autonomy it needs to fulfill this mission. Let me complicate this a little further. That academic social compact, as I call it, is necessary for any kind of academic work. It defines our priorities and the conditions of possibility for the work we do at any particular moment. And this social compact is always evolving. It's always being redefined, and it's always being contested by different kinds of visions and stakeholders inside higher ed and outside of it. And not all versions of the academic social compact are filled with civic and democratic values. Sometimes, and I'd say this is true now, the social compact emphasizes job training and economic growth, more instrumental in economic outcomes. At different times in our history, it's emphasized technocratic leadership and expert power. In the 19th century, it emphasized the preparation of elite white males for civic leadership, teaching, and preaching. In fact, the democratic versions and visions of this kind of compact that the Truman Commission and others have advanced often have to assert themselves against these other non-democratic versions of the legitimacy and value of higher education. But I'm stressing it here because the democratic vision of higher education, the democracy project of higher education, cannot be activated unless it also wins public consent for its vision of what it means to educate citizens and strengthen we the people and build communities. Winning that consent and reshaping the social compact was the whole purpose of the Truman Report and the purpose of the work that, along with many others and many of you, I've been doing for 20 years. And that leads to a fifth takeaway, which is that thinking about this idea of higher education for democracy can never simply be a matter of norms and ideals and themes. It's never simply a matter of constructing and then operationalizing some ideal model of democratic education. It's always a historical process that's full of change and power and conflict. And it draws on what I've called this democracy tradition in higher education. That tradition's had its own internal conflicts, its own different kinds of flavors. Sometimes it's focused on the founding of racial and gender inclusive institutions. Sometimes it's focused on radical pedagogy. Sometimes it's focused on service learning and community partnerships. Sometimes it's involved public policies like the defense of affirmative action or Pell Grants or the California Community College system. The terms of what we mean by education for democracy are always changing and always in struggle with non-democratic visions of higher ed. And this democracy tradition is always grappling with our failures of democracy and the failures of higher ed to be democratic, with what the report called the discrepancies between ideal and actual. So there's no blueprint, there's no strategic plan for this, there's no definition for it. There's a historical process of wrestling with what we mean by democracy and higher education. My final takeaway is that is something that builds on this notion that democracy in higher education is a historical process. It's the idea that these moments of democratizing higher ed especially happen in times of crisis, not just incremental change. The Truman Commission report actually tells its story as a story of crisis. It says, one last quote, "It's essential today that education come decisively to grips with the worldwide crisis of mankind. This is no careless or uncritical use of words. No thinking person doubts we are living in a decisive moment of human history. A century ago, even political thinkers who didn't approve of democracy accepted its triumph as inevitable. But today we cannot be sure." It's hard to read these words without thinking of the situation that we're in now. Substitute climate change for the atomic age, and this could have been written yesterday. The report was published in 1947 after the Allied victory in World War II on the edge of the atomic age, and it accurately saw itself as coming in a time of crisis. But it's interesting that all the important advances for democratic education in America, or most of them, have come in times of crisis. The land grants were founded in the middle of the Civil War. John Dewey and Jane Addams' work came during the industrial and immigration crises of the progressive era. The 1960s were a kind of cauldron of experimentation around radical pedagogy. Dewey famously has this line that democracy must be reborn in every generation, and education is its midwife. But I'd amend that to say democracy is reborn in every generation, education is its mother, and crisis is its midwife. And that's actually why I wanted to pose these ideas to you in the context of the Truman Report, because it models what it means to be generative and creative in a period of intense crisis. It models the way crisis can open up positive, big thinking. And we need to hear that today because we are in a crisis. The pandemic, of course, and its devastating economic effects where all of us are grappling with that. The pandemic of racism that's provoked an uprising in our campuses and on our streets, and rightfully so. We're also in the middle of a crisis of democratic trust, of political tribalism that makes this upcoming election especially consequential. It's hard not to feel exhausted, demoralized, sometimes hopeless. Never has it seemed that democratic agency and solidarity are more necessary. And at least for me and many people I talk to, never has it been so hard to kind of find those strengths. It has felt impossible to mobilize the democratic energy that we need. So what do we do with that? The first thing I want to say is that the pandemic, the current economic crisis, the uprising against white supremacy have shone a light on what was a longer-term crisis in higher education. Our problems didn't begin in 2020. The current crises have amplified problems that have been long-standing. They have to do with the conservative political Reagan revolution undermining of public support for higher ed, with changes in the economy that made college more important and yet less affordable to go to, with rising debt and tuition and student work levels, with lowering or languishing graduation rates, increasing reliance on adjuncts and outsourcing of faculty and the precarity of faculty labor, increasing transfers and credit shopping among students. All of you, I'm sure, are living some versions of these problems, and you know them as well as I do, or better than I do. I just add that along with those fiscal crises and those institutional crises and the breakdown of learning communities that all of us have had to grapple with, there's also been a crisis of legitimacy in higher ed. The social compact that defined the GI Bill and the growth of systems like the 3 California systems, that social compact has begun to fray. And in its place has been an increasingly privatized, instrumentalized, and non-democratic social compact of what higher education should do and what it should be. The idea that the goal of a college degree was nothing but individual economic security as defined by compliance with the current demands of the job market. The ideas expressed in that Truman Commission report of the citizen as a whole person, of the democratic community, have waned. Inequality between sectors and between students has deepened. And so this moment of crisis and even catastrophe that we're living through has accelerated problems that we were already starting to grapple with. And we now have a reckoning where we have to deal with them. But I want to argue that one of the lessons of the democracy tradition in America is that we actually have resources and creativity to meet this moment, and we have to mobilize them. We have to reinvent the democracy tradition. The past 40 years have been a time not just of crisis, but also of creativity and innovation in civic and democratic education. The 80s were not only the time of Reagan-era disinvestment in higher ed, they're a time when campus compact and service learning movements were founded, and so were the movements for ethnic studies and more inclusive curricula. The police murders of 2015 sparked the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement across American campuses and in the streets. And this year's murders spread that organizing even further into a multiracial movement. There's still a lot of work to do. There's still enormous conflict and backlash. But I think our story has been as much about the mobilizing of democratic energies in response to these crises as it's been to the crises themselves. So let me suggest that we apply to the moment we're living through these frameworks that I've been trying to describe to you about both the values of democratic education and a sense of the contexts where those values can be activated. What resources and practices and traditions can we draw on to renew the ideals of educating students as civic persons and supporting democratic communities? What can we draw on to democratize what I was calling the who of education, and the how of it, and the what of it, and the where of it? How can we contest the drift toward inequality and toward a privatized, more instrumental vision of the goals of higher education? How can we reanimate the civic and democratic view of our mission? And what would a contemporary version of the Truman Commission report focus on? Let me offer several thoughts of what I would want to focus on in the current moment, but also invite your thoughts, because this is really a set of challenges and questions for collective thinking. The first thing I'd say is that in this moment, animating the civic and democratic tradition means grappling head-on with issues of equity, and especially grappling with the connection between civic engagement and the dismantling of white supremacy. I say the connection between those two things because it seems to me that grappling and that educational work go both ways. Anti-racism theory and practice has important challenges and offerings for renewing and reshaping democratic education. This includes reflecting on and acknowledging the ways in which past models of civic and democratic learning have had implicit and sometimes explicit bias, and also how those relationships have sometimes exploited communities of color. And at the same time, the traditions of civic and community engagement, the traditions of partnership and reciprocity and public work, I think have resources and models to offer to the work of anti-racism on campus. Second thought, the current crisis has exposed and amplified the precariousness of student lives, especially students of color, low-income students, first-generation students, immigrant students, and dreamers. Precarity in terms of their housing, their access to food security, unequal access to technology, connectedness, space, and quiet, if we all have to go to remote learning and teaching, and also the emotional and psychosocial harms of all that this precarity has caused and created. We need to more intentionally understand students' needs and vulnerabilities as part of the democratic community of care, part of the mission of democratic engagement that we are striving to build. Third takeaway for what democracy in higher education means at this moment. The Truman Commission report was issued at a moment when its authors believed that American society had beaten back anti-democratic forces, the forces of fascism and Nazism. We're in a moment that is witnessing the erosion of democratic norms involving vigilante violence, abusive policing, the rule of law, access to voting, the institutionalization of rule by minorities, the curtailment of freedom and economic security for the press and the media, and the rising power of disinformation and misinformation. All different issues, but together a crisis of democratic culture and democratic life. This election will be a moment of crisis for the strength of our democratic culture, not only in what the outcome is, but how it's prosecuted and what its aftermath is. This democracy crisis also intersects and makes worse the crises of white supremacy and of economic inequality. So more than our movement has done in the past, I think the civic engagement movement on campuses has to engage students in the issues of strengthening democratic public culture, democratic institutions, and even figuring out how to build trust in renewed democratic institutions. Final proposal: American society is increasingly polarized along lines of race, access to education, urban-rural divides, and social class. Polarization involves very real struggles about important political policy and cultural issues, and these require contestation and debate. But the toxicity of our polarization also undermines the capacity for democratic engagement about these issues, to the point where polarized communities live in separate cognitive bubbles with separate experiences of reality. It'll be important for academic institutions and for our students and ourselves to engage communities that are polarized from each other, and also communities from which we ourselves are polarized. It will eventually threaten us existentially, threaten our autonomy and our access to resources if we cannot develop strategies for mediating polarization in the communities with which we work. This is something the movement for academic and civic engagement has only started to grapple with, I think. So these are just four of what I'm sure are a whole range of important suggestions for new priorities of our democracy work. You may disagree with them, you may think they're incomplete or wrong-headed. I look forward to any thoughts you may have. But we still need to figure out what are the key tasks of civic and democratic education and learning in this moment. What's the kind of work that the Truman Commission, what's the kind of work that we should do that are on analogy to what the Truman Commission was proposing? Here and now, how do we welcome all students and help to empower them to become civic selves? Here and now, how do we work to build just, inclusive, democratic campuses and communities? Here and now, how do we work to create a multiracial, cross-class, multi-regional, and yet still solidary we the people? How do we work to create academic institutions that can work for all of those goals? And in doing that, in this moment, how can we turn what feels so exhausting and demoralizing into an opening for positive change? Thanks for listening. It will be great to lurk and hear your thoughts. If you have questions, I'm delighted to answer them now, or just to take part in the breakout rooms. Thanks to everyone.
Yes, just a question. Many of them want to know the quotes that you have given and you read out. They would like to have a link to that, and also if there is a specific page number for it, they want to see that in writing. They absolutely loved it.
Oh, great. So I will give a link. As I say, I downloaded from Google Books the whole 6-volume report. All of those quotations were from the first volume, and I'll make a punch list for and send them to you all for that. But I would say go to the source.
There's just a lot of rich dialogue back and forth.
Good, I look forward to read it.
Yes, so not really any more questions, just enjoying.
Good, thank you. I'm just catching up with it now.
So if there aren't any more questions, Patty, shall we start the second hour then?
I was going to ask, would folks, if you do have questions, please put them in the chat here. This is just an incredible opportunity to continue this dialogue with Dr. Scobey. I think he's given us so much to think about here. So please, you know, again, if you have any questions or comments, put them in the chat.
We do have a question. It says, I am in humanities and I see that it is being dropped. How do we update and get it back into schools, increasing the value in schools?
It's a great question.
I didn't understand that.
Sorry?
No, it was just, okay.
It's a great question. I think the questioner may know this already from the brief bio, but all of my work as a cultural historian has been in the humanities. I think it's absolutely essential that not just that we fight for the humanities, but that we make the point that that process of creating a community together, what I sometimes shorthand as creating we the people, requires meaning making together, storytelling together, grappling with our past together, and collective imagination. The humanities is absolutely essential to that. I don't think we academic humanists have made that case as strongly as we need to, but it's a case that it needs made. And in my experience, actually, students love it when they see that connecting of meaning making and storytelling to what matters most in public life.
Another question for you. How do issues of academic freedom come into this dialogue?
That's a really great and thorny question. It cuts in all different directions. So let me give a couple points and invite more thinking together about it. We want an academy in which there is space for complicated and contested and critical thinking from all different points of view. We also want an academy, I would argue, that does better at collaborative and generous thinking, which is not to say that dissent or conflict should be censored, but that we often don't point academic freedom enough towards creating norms among our students and ourselves of collaboration and collective generous knowledge making. That's one dimension of what I would say. And then the last thing I would say is that many controversies that are pitched as academic freedom controversies are actually freedom of expression controversies. And those are two different things. The ambit of academic freedom is more limited than our rights to say whatever we want in the public sphere. And when students or academics exercise those rights and are challenged for it, that's not necessarily a challenge to academic freedom. It's just an argument over expression.
What are we to do about education just for career goals?
That's a great question. I'm so glad you asked. One of the things that, if I had more time, I would say is that this vision of holistic and democratic learning is as relevant for pre-professional and pre-vocational learning as it is for so-called liberal arts learning. But we don't often do a good job of building the kind of scaffolded teaching and learning, reflective learning into vocational programs as we should. I think we want to dismantle the kind of segregation of vocational and liberal learning, and that means infusing liberal learning into vocational teaching and learning, and also giving students in liberal arts programs more opportunities to think about their own future as with work.
What is your take on some of the Republican think tanks?
That feels too broad a question. I need a little bit more specificity.
Okay, they can put that in the chat. Next question is, any suggestions to move it forward, and can we talk later?
We can definitely talk later. My whole work is about moving this forward, as Patty knows, and I invite whoever that is to reach out to me personally at Scobey, Cobey, at bttop.org. But I actually invite anyone to reach me personally and to explore the Bringing Theory to Practice website. I should also say that we are part of a large movement across higher ed of people working for civic and democratic learning that includes Campus Compact and Imagining America in the Arts and Humanities, and Project Pericles, and the American Democracy Project among many state universities. So reach out to me, and as my kids would say, we'll hook you up.
Question, how would you address the challenge of the perspective of academia, science, higher ed being viewed as indoctrination?
I would, that's again another really important question. I think the first thing to do is actually bring real stories and real evidence to that conversation, if the person launching that critique is open to listening about it. I actually think we in higher ed need to be way more patient and way more vigilant about listening to and engaging our critics. That's the whole reason I keep stressing that academic social compact. If we don't show people the value of what we're doing and the complexity of what we're doing, then we will not be able to do the work that we want to do. And in my experience, much of the time, not all of the time, a person who launches that critique of indoctrination is reading things but doesn't know an awful lot about the actual life of the academy. And sometimes they're onto really important things we need to grapple with.
Okay. Should we start teaching the concepts of civic and social responsibilities and engagement K through 12?
I think so, and I think there's already a movement in K-12 to do that. It's my own prejudices are towards the kind of experiential learning by doing in which people see themselves as what I'm calling civic selves. That's an idea that I learned from my friend and colleague Harry Boyd. That notion of seeing yourself, having agency and being effective and being engaged in important shared matters. And that's as important, if not more so, for children to be able to experience as anyone else. That's civics book learning, I think, is much less effective than that kind of experiential civic learning.
I want to respect David's time, and I know we're a little over here, and just to make sure that, again, we had him for the hour, and I see all the questions now that are being populated, and many questions. So this is a good thing, because this obviously has sparked a tremendous amount of interest on your parts. And as I said, take a look at David's work, his publications. You've only gotten a little taste of this. And again, hopefully you're all starting to see how important this is. And so David, Kimberly, and I, and the rest of the 3CSN group, we just want to say thank you so much. This has just been a fantastic presentation.